Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Path 11 podcast. I have a wonderful guest today who is joining me, Edie Nathan. We met Edie at this year's Afterlife Awareness Conference, which was held online due to the pandemic. If you haven't seen it yet, this year's conference will only be available until the end of the month on September 30th, 2020. Since there isn't a whole lot of time left to watch, we're giving you a 25% discount. Just use the coupon code all caps, closeout 25 when registering, and then you'll be able to watch almost 20 hours of compelling talks and discussions around the afterlife. So without further ado, I'm not sure if any of you guys have ever watched the show on A&E TV called Psychic Kids, but you might recognize Edie because she was the certified hypnotherapist and EMDR therapist who was a consultant there for that show. And so she talked a little bit about Psychic Kids at the Afterlife Awareness Conference, but we're really not going to focus on that today, although her presentation was fascinating for those of you who are listeners and are parents and have tapped into, noticing that your children have some psychic ability. She is a great consultant for that. Edie's also a New York native. She's down in Long Island. Her office is in New York City, but she hasn't gotten there since the pandemic. But I'm sure she is working virtually, and we're going to hear from her in just a second. But I wanted to let you know a little bit more about her. She is an author. Her book is called It's Grief, The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. And that is one of the topics that we are going to talk about today, grief, loss, and trauma. She is an author, a public speaker, and licensed therapist. She is an AASECT certified sex therapist, hypnotherapist, and certified EMDR practitioner with more than 20 years experience. She's also earned degrees from New York University and Fordham University with postgraduate training at the Ackerman Institute for Family Therapy. Edie, welcome to the Path 11 podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, great to see you again. I really loved your presentation. It was one of my favorites, but, I always love hearing about children's psychic abilities, and they are such teachers for us as adults and remind us like who we used to be when we were their age, and they're really important to listen to. So it was a great presentation.
Oh, thank you. I had so much fun putting it together, and part of the presentation was about a hero's journey, and truly we are, all of us, universally in a hero's journey right now. And that hero's journey is how we started in February or March in our ordinary lives, and then we were hit with this COVID, and we all went into like a cave, and it was different for everyone. And that cave for some was also emblematic of grief and loss. And then now we're trying to emerge and figure out, how are we going to go back into an ordinary life? What does ordinary even mean? And who are we? And that's really grief.
Yeah. And I definitely want to talk more about that because I think all of our listeners, everyone in the world, is experiencing either some sort of grief, trauma, or loss during this whole pandemic that we're all living through. And I know that you're going to speak to a lot of great points on that. But before we kind of get to the meat and potatoes, I'd like you to just give our listeners a little bit more of your background and, just the stuff that you have been doing, some of your training, and, why you have written a book about grief and your hero's journey has kind of brought you here in this place now.
Sure. So we all come to our hero's journey through I think of it in terms of multiples. We meet many, many people along the way, and they hit us, they charge us, they affect us, they change us, they move us. And people open us up to experiences. And the work that I presently do really was a journey unto itself, and led to being a therapist, led to writing a book, led to the desire to do all these different kinds of trainings. And sometimes I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and being a perfectionist, I want to get it right. And perfectionism can be one of your greatest teachers. So throughout my learning process. It's been about letting go of some of the perfectionism and allowing, like the children from Psychic Kids or the elders, to be my greatest teachers. And this process of becoming a hypnotherapist or using something called EMDR. And for those of you who've never heard of this, it's actually a tool that's used for people who've experienced trauma. And it stands for eye movement desensitization and restructuring. And God, it's loaded. EMDR is so much easier to say, but it's actually working with the brain, the right and the left brain, and finding a different communication to help the trauma, because the trauma itself is like a negative communication in the brain, and the memory of that trauma is frozen. And what EMDR does is it helps you to unfreeze the memory, the pictures, the voices, the sense that are associated to the trauma, and give you new ideas and thoughts and voices to that trauma. So that's a collective of my work and my process. And it is because I've had, along my own path, lots of different trauma experiences, from having been pretty badly bullied to being a sexual abuse survivor, and then having lost a partner when I was 27.
And have you used these techniques like hypnotherapy and EMDR through your own healing, which is what led you to want to use them in your own practice?
Absolutely, yes. They sometimes, when we are in a state of deep grief or trauma, we don't have the words to express what's going on. It's so primal. It's like, how do you explain the feeling of a burning inside your heart? How do you explain that? How do you explain this emptiness in your gut, or this sense of being so lost that you don't know where you are or who you are? So these tools, these tasks that I undertook with hypnotherapy and EMDR and utilizing really creative methods, including clay and pottery, to expand the conversation of the emotions that often don't have words.
So one of the things that I'm curious about is, now that you haven't been able to be in your office in person, have you moved at all to video sessions with your clients, and have you been able to do any hypnotherapy and EMDR through this type of forum?
So great question, and it's all Zoom. I I feel like I'm a Zoom zombie sometimes, and it's, the work is much more intense on Zoom. And yes, I'm able to do hypnotherapy. I'm able to do EMDR using Zoom, and EMDR is it's a really easy thing to be able to do online, because it's either a sound that kind of goes back and forth, and it taps into your right brain and left brain, or it's a dot that moves back and forth. And when you look at the dot, you're just moving left brain, right brain, left brain, right brain. And it's a way of really changing the neural pathways within the brain, given very specific prompts by the therapist to the client. And the EMDR session usually lasts longer than a regular session. They're usually 90 minutes because there's a prep, and then there's the session itself, and then there's a discussion afterwards.
Yeah, and are you actually piping the sound through? Where is it oscillating from right to left ear that they can hear?
Yeah, so there are free, actually, YouTube programs with the sound and with the dancing dot, and some people choose to look at the dot going back and forth and and listen. Some people just choose to watch the dot, and other people choose to just listen. So you've got a variety of techniques. In the past, another technique that's used with EMDR is tapping. So it's either tapping the kneecaps or tapping the hands. And it's rhythmic, and that rhythm can change. So depending, it can go fast, you can slow it down. And the idea is you're using the brain to reprocess in different like statics, if you will.
Yeah, it's really fascinating work. I have done it personally to heal some past trauma, and it was like a miracle. I just couldn't, I was like, oh my God, this really worked.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. It's really great stuff. And I think, for those who are listening, it would be really good if you have been in therapy, traditional therapy, talk therapy, and maybe have never explored anything like hypnotherapy or EMDR. I would say try to do a search in your area and find a therapist that is trained in it that can, share this tool with you, because it works wonders. And I think what I love about it is that people don't have to be in therapy for 20, 30 years. These sessions change people's lives in a matter of like a block of sessions too. So that's what I really like about it, because we're also working within the brain. They have found out now where the trauma gets stored and how we can, move this so that people don't have to be living and carrying this trauma their whole lives.
You're so right. They've actually been able to back this up with data. They've scanned in an MRI machine the brain of someone who's had trauma, and they've had the person speak about the trauma, give the narrative of the trauma, and scan the brain while that's going on. And then they take the person out of the MRI machine. They've done it two different ways. One, doing an EMDR session while in the MRI machine and seeing how the neural pathways actually begin to change, and they've taken the person out, done some sessions, and then rescanned the brain, asking the person to tell the same story. And they've been able to see how the brain has changed. It's really, it feels magical.
It is. And I've seen a lot of people's lives change as a result of doing that type of therapy. So
Yes.
highly recommend it. So let's go into kind of talking about, I love the word that you used before we started recording, but these spiritual emergencies that people are taking on during this pandemic. And let's go a little bit more into what you're noticing people are experiencing with the grief, the loss, and the trauma of our world completely being turned upside down. No one has ever experienced what we're experiencing now as a world, really. And it's loaded with all of these things. And, I think that you can help our listeners understand that some of these reactions that they're having are really normal grief reactions and very common when people are going through loss and trauma. So I'd just love to give you the floor and go wherever you would like for as long as you'd like on this, because you have some important stuff to say about it.
Thank you. It's a tough topic, and it's a topic that so often people don't want to talk about. They want to shy away from it. They want to run from it, as a matter of fact. And the idea of being able to discover the self through this process is what is exciting for me as a clinician to share with your listeners. That if you step into this and you are willing to say, you know what, I might learn about how to become my best self through this process. And I don't have to be afraid of it, because the more I fear it, the bigger it becomes. The less I fear it, the more I dance with it, I partner with it. Then the grief becomes, yes, this partner who's got my back, who's teaching me to be awake in ways that I've never been awake. And so that's, if we look at this virus and how it's brought us down, it is a universal experience. It is a collective experience. There is people around the world know what COVID is. There's no language barrier with COVID. We know what it is. We know how it's brought us down. We know how it's isolated us. We know how it's also made us, many folks, call into question their lives, their livelihoods, their relationships, their relationship with the self, the soul, and the psyche, and also learn about what it is to grieve, and grieve perhaps in isolation from a true loss of a loved one, and what happens when the rituals are taken away. Now, I know I just kind of put out a lot of information, but it's all happening. We are in a huge reassessment phase. There's a term called liminal space, and liminal space is a space where you're at a threshold and you don't know what comes next. And so this COVID-19 has put us in this liminal space. We're facing a threshold and we just don't even know what's going to come next. What's happening? What can we look forward to? What can we plan on? What can we do to nurture ourselves? And through this time, there can be this spiritual emergency. The spiritual emergency is a crisis that's internal, and it makes you tight. It could cause your jaw to clench. It could make you angry and anxious, being aware of regrets, thinking of times when you felt shame, and perhaps lacking a certain empathy for yourself, for your soul, and maybe even for others, because they couldn't show up for you the way you expected. Those are all parts of grief. The spiritual emergency is a grief yearning reaction. It's a lost sense of the self. It's anger that has nowhere to go. It's a deep taking on of, it's like you've got Zeus in the room and Zeus is saying, "You going to fight me? I don't think so." And you're saying, "Well, I'm going to try to fight you." And Zeus is saying, "No, you can't fight me. I'm bigger than you." And you see the power of Zeus. And instead of even trying to fight, you stop. And it is in that stopping, in that lost sense of meeting your own resilience in this fight, that can cause this spiritual emergency. And it hurts. It hurts everywhere. It hurts in your feet. It hurts in your butt. It hurts in your belly, in your gut. It hurts in your throat. It hurts in your head. And it attacks your heart. And this kind of grief is a grief that is dark and black and bleak. And in this time, especially so, because the way that we as Homo sapiens have coped is by gathering, by holding, by showing up, by bringing food over, by gently following a course, or by seeking therapy, or by just saying, "I need you to hold me and I need to cry." So when these elements of survival have been taken away, the spiritual emergency is even deeper and darker. And yet, when we go so dark and we go so deep, and we really look at ourselves and our souls, and we start to listen in ways we never thought we would be able to listen to ourselves. We are in, yes, a moment of crisis, but we are also in the process of meeting our unexpected allies. And those unexpected allies come out in the darkness. And the unexpected ally might be, "I got to get out of this marriage. I got to move. I got to change my job. And now my focus is on being a best self, a better self, a more enlightened self, a less fearful self, a self that will take chances, that will begin to listen in ways that you've never listened before. And that helps you find your unexpected allies. I do this work because my husband died, and he was an unexpected ally in this. And his voice is throughout all of my work. And I don't know what I would be doing had that not happened when I was 27, but it did. And now I'm here. And so we have these moments, these nodal points that are change agents and our allies to help us along the path.
Now, what would you say to some people who are having the spiritual emergency and they're kind of feeling paralyzed in it? They're paralyzed in the grief. They're panic stricken. They're just feeling like they can't even find a sense of spirituality because some of the anxiety and the angst is just too overwhelming for them to even function. And maybe it may not even be anxiety, but it could be depression, where there's like no motivation. They can't seek out or feel connected to anything. And as you know, suicide rates are on the rise, and more so than the number of people passing away from this virus. So, if there's anyone out there listening that maybe needs to hear something, what would you offer for advice during that type of spiritual emergency where they're not making the move, they're not going forward with a divorce or changing their job, they are just completely paralyzed?
So in that darkness of being paralyzed, there's a narrative that's frozen. And in that frozen narrative, one of the things that most people are not doing is breathing. Now, I know that we breathe, and I know that, they wouldn't be listening to this if they weren't breathing, but there are different kinds of breath. And one of the first places to start truly is to take a few minutes and start to breathe. And that breathing is taking in a deep breath and holding it for 2 seconds and letting it go. And doing this 3 or 4 times in a series. When we get stuck in our narrative, and you use the word paralyzed, and suicide is a form of being paralyzed. They don't really want to end their lives. They just want to end the pain. They want the pain to quiet. And so often there is a feeling of being unheard, unseen, unsafe, and there's no one to reach out to. Now, to say don't do it alone when we are living in isolation, you can still reach out. There are helplines. There are places of worship that have phone lines. They have, if you have a computer, you can access help. And often what stops us from getting help is a sense of either shame or guilt or feeling like you're too much. And you're never too much. Let's change that cognition. It is about changing the thoughts, and changing the thoughts from a negative cognition, which is really just a negative thought. I am bad. I am not worth it. I can't do this. I am stuck. To, I can reach out for help. I don't have to do this alone. I am going to contact one person I know. And even if I am an introvert, I probably know one person, and I'm going to reach out to them and just say, I need help. And it takes courage to ask for help. So I would first start with just breathing enough so that you can just settle yourself. The anxiety is probably pretty high, and we don't really have the time to go into all of the different types of anxiety. However, anxiety is very akin and close with anger. When anger gets expelled, the anxiety will lessen. So if you find that you're angry and you usually put the anger on yourself, you beat yourself up, or you're paralyzed, or you're hurting, you're self-harming, whether it's not eating or not sleeping, those are also forms of self-harming, or you're cutting yourself, a form of self-harming. It's usually associated to anxiety, and anxiety is very, very closely correlated to that anger. And anger, we don't want to feel our anger. But when you let go of the anger, the anxiety, guess what? It dissipates. It lessens. It doesn't completely go away, but it definitely lessens. So I'd like anybody who's feeling the anxiety to tap into your anger. See what happens to your sense of feeling paralyzed, because they all work in tandem.
Great points. Great points. Can we also go back to the ritual aspects of this? I'm sure you have worked with shamans before, in the past. I've done some work with shamans, and they're all about ritual, right? It's all about ritual. And in the Western culture, I think a lot of that is lost, the sense of community and doing ritual with community and things like that, which is why when those practices, I think, are brought into the West, people eat it up because they could just feel it, it just feels so good to have these rituals. And we have a lot of rituals here in our Western culture. And I think the pandemic is showing us that maybe some people might have taken some of those rituals for granted. Even birthday celebrations, right? That's a ritual. And some of the shamanic practices might be like a fire ritual or a water ritual, but, those are kind of intense and a little more intricate, but a birthday party is a ritual. Graduation, how many kids kind of really suffered not being able to walk across the stage, or moving up day, or those, kindergartners going into first grade. So we have a lot of rituals that I think we have awoken to see, or have woken up to see that, wow, these really carry a lot of importance for us. And also, like you were talking about earlier, anyone who has passed away, not related to COVID, just, people are still dying for other reasons, and how some of the ceremonies for funerals are also being taken away. So it's like double the loss.
Yes.
Yeah. So can you talk about the
you really said it. Yeah. The double the loss. It is you lose a loved one, whether it's from COVID or not, and then you're not able to follow through on those very important, necessary rituals. A burial, a wake, a joining of a group of people who will tell stories and laugh, and maybe have a glass of wine or a beer and just celebrate a life lived. And our goodbyes are very different right now. I know I had an uncle who passed away during this time, not from COVID, and they had a Zoom service, and it was like, wow, like I can't say goodbye to my Uncle Bob, not the way that I would have wanted to, nor could I have visited him, because where he was on lockdown. And so we feel also that we might not have been able to say goodbye in the way that we wanted to say goodbye, that we weren't able to do the rituals, whatever those rites or rituals were. We talk about, funerals, weddings, all life-changing experiences that with the few rituals that we do have in the Western world, that we have not even been able to follow through and be celebratory or mournful. And yet, have you found creative ways to move through some rituals? And let me give you an example. So, because the funeral and the funeral rite has really been taken away, some people decided to, on their computer, they sent around a blank piece of paper, and everyone told a story about their loved one who passed, and maybe dropped in a picture or two. And this went around a family circle, a friend circle, and they were able to create their own ceremony, their own ritual, their own rite. And some people included drumming music, and some people included flute music or rock and roll, depending. And so it is finding new ways of honoring the rituals that we've lost and harvesting new rituals. And so now is a time to harvest in our loss, in our grief, perhaps new rituals, perhaps new moments of meaning that are substantial. And this time right now may be a time of creating new rituals. And there are rituals that don't have to do with life-changing events. The ritual of getting up and going to work in the morning, the ritual of, putting on your work clothes and being gone from 6 a.m. or 7 until 9. That was a ritual. Well, that ritual isn't here anymore. It's changed. It's shifted. And how do we reckon with those lost rituals? If we think about all the other rituals that we have in our lives, how we recognize the 4th of July or Mother's Day or Father's Day, and what they meant within a family or within a couple or within a gathering of friends who were graduating college, high school, kindergarten. And how can you and me and anyone who how can we honor by being in the creation of the new voice, of the spiritual emergence, moving out of the emergency and into an emergence, which is an opening that allows for, okay, yes, I am grieving and I am mourning and I feel stuck or paralyzed, but that emergence comes out when I reach out for help and I see somebody actually cares. Or that opening happens when I realize that I had a moment in my life that I made a decision that hasn't worked out, but I now have a moment now to make another decision and go down another path, and who knows where that's going to take me. To allow yourself to be curious in the development of these rituals, to allow yourself to be curious when anxiety hits. How is it a teacher? To be curious about your anger, to be curious about moments when you feel malaise versus depression versus sadness, and to be able to accurately label what's going on with you creates an internal knowing that can, open the world up, open up relationships, open up community, and open up what I'm now calling safe pods. People who are like-minded and they are acting in very safe ways. And it may be a new creation of the new family or the new schooling pod. And it's all developing as a result of our grief and our loss.
I loved how you put those words together, emergency and then emergence. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I hope that lands with everyone like it landed with me. That was really good. Well, Edie, if people want to get more information about you know, the book that you had written, you know, working with you if you are in New York, right? Because you're licensed in New York. Are you licensed in any other state?
No, I'm just licensed in New York right now.
Okay.
Working to get licensed in Massachusetts, but licensure right now is very hard because of everything that's going on. But and hopefully, we are really working on having a united licensure because it's just
Ridiculous.
it's ridiculous. It is. And yes, people can certainly reach me through my website, which is edinathan.com. And my book is It's Grief, The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. And what I'd love, and you can find that on Amazon and or through my website. And if you go to my website and you mention that you heard me on this podcast, what I will send you is one chapter from the book, chapter 11, which are the 11 phases of grief. And what you'll also find in the book is a greater explanation of anxiety and of anger and all of the different ways that those can land with you. So
excellent. Wonderful.
be curious and unfreeze from the narrative and allow yourself to find your unexpected allies.
Thank you so much, Edie. And I really recommend everybody to head on over to her website. Let her know that you heard her here on the Path 11 podcast, and you get chapter 11. Look at that, 11 phases. You know, what a coincidence, right? So
Yes.
Thank you, Edie, and thank you for gifting our listeners with that. I really appreciate that. And it's always wonderful to talk with you. Are you going to be at the conference next year in June? Maybe we'll be there in person. We'll see.
Hopefully I will be, yes.
Great.
And I would imagine so. And wherever it is, that's where I'll be. And
Okay.
yes.
All right. So
Thank
we'll either hold it online again like we did this year, which actually worked out really well.
It did.
Yeah.
You guys did a great job.
Thanks. Or maybe we'll see each other in person.
I would love that. Okay. So thank you so much for this opportunity. It was lovely talking with you.
Yes. Thank you. Same here. Thanks, Edie. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening today.